Today on Inside the Issues, I speak with Robert Pastor on North American integration. Hello and welcome to this week's edition of Inside the Issues, a CG online podcast. I'm David Welch, CG Chair of Global Security at the Balsillie School of International Affairs and Professor of Political Science at the University of Waterloo. Every week I welcome a guest here into the studios at the Centre for International Governance Innovation in Waterloo, Ontario to speak about some important topic of global governance. And today it's my great pleasure to welcome Professor Robert Pastor, Professor of Political Science at American University and also Director of the Center for North American Studies. Welcome. And we're here in part to talk about and in part to celebrate your new book, The North American Idea, A Vision of a Continental Future. And when you were presenting on this book earlier today, Bob, I was thinking that it's remarkable that this is the first book that's actually on this subject, when in fact the topic of North American integration has been in the air for a very long time, more than 100 years at least. Do you understand why it is that we're only now beginning to think through the concept of a North American idea in the detail that you do in this book? And could you just let us know a bit about how you think about the North American idea as opposed to simply policy coordination or integration between three countries in North America?
What occurred to me that the US, Canada, and Mexico have been bumping into each other for a couple of hundred years. And since NAFTA, we have tried to address a very complicated agenda, one problem, one issue, one country at a time. And we're not making any progress. And I think the main reason we're not making any progress is because our three peoples don't have the idea of North America in their mind. They think that they can solve a particular problem, but that's not good enough because each problem exists because there is a particular interest that likes the way it's being done right now. And to overcome that particular interest, a domestic interest for a government, is not easy to do in the absence of a sense that we're part of something larger. And that will require some compromises in the way we think about each other and some balance in the relationship, because the essence of the North American relationship is the imbalance in power between the US on the one hand and Canada and Mexico on the other. And so it's going to require an adjustment on all three countries in the way they look at themselves and each other, and most importantly, the way they look at the future of North America. So I wrote the book about what the North American idea is and should be, how we should contemplate this future relationship, understanding that we're not there right now, but that this is a direction that's worth moving towards.
Now, were you inspired by the idea of Europe? That's sort of the obvious other region that we think about when we think about large-scale continental integration. And there's a detailed concept of Europe, which has had its ups and downs and limited buy-in, but buy-in nonetheless. Is that the kind of idea you had in mind when you were sitting down to write this book?
Actually not. I was certainly informed by the European experience, and indeed any experience of integrating sovereign countries should look to Europe because they've had the most in-depth and complicated effort and exercise to create a larger unit. But I was not inspired because I'm too aware of the differences. Europe came to a sense of solidarity because of two cataclysmic wars. And they had to merge many different countries, all of which were roughly at the same level of power and development, maybe two different levels of power and development, but not one superpower among them. North America is very different. We have one superpower. We have two countries with friendly relations among all of them. We have a stronger sense of our differences and less awareness of what we share in common. And so I guess while I try to be informed and learn from Europe, I'm really more inspired by what makes North America, what shapes the common characteristics of North America rather than differences.
Now you talked about the North American idea today and the North American idea that we could see in the future. When you talk about it today, is it anything more than, say, NAFTA, North American Free Trade Agreement, an economic community intending to promote freer trade, freer investment? Is it anything more than that, or do you see glimmers of additional components to a North American idea that might include cultural factors or mutual identification or some kind of solidarity broadly across the foreign policy spectrum?
I think there are about 20% of the public in all three countries actually do have a broader sense of what it means to be North American. Many of them are on the borders because they move back and forth, and they have a sense of family on both sides of the border. They have a sense of a society that's changing. Some of them are businesses that work back and forth across the border. But I'd say no more than 20% have a sense of North America as anything more than a market that's struggling to emerge. I think there's another 15 or 20% have such a strong sense and insecurity about their own nation that they are determined and zealous in trying to prevent any serious conversation about North America as a whole. And tragically, they have dominated the debate. They have kept the debate from happening. They have kept the North American idea from being on the radar screen. And 60% of the public, and I make these distinctions based on long analysis of public opinion polls in all three countries over 40 years. I have a chapter in the book on that. I'd say 60% really want much more, much deeper cooperation and integration, but it's not a major issue for them. It's one that they could be mobilized to support with real leadership and imagination, but otherwise they're much more interested in 20 other topics. So the climate is there. The tragedy is that the 20% that are zealous advocates of absolute sovereignty of another century are the ones that are shaping or rather inhibiting the debate.
Do you find them in all three countries, or are they concentrated in one or two?
No, they're in all three countries. Right now, ironically and paradoxically, the country with the strongest sovereignty advocates, the ones that are most fearful losing their sovereignty, happen to be in the richest and most powerful country, the United States. I mean, I've been in the media with Lou Dobbs and Bill O'Reilly, and they've made the case, don't you know that Mexico and Canada are trying to take over the United States? And I said, you can't be serious. I've been to Canada and Mexico, all over the countries. The very idea that they could take over the United States is so alien, it could be coming from a different planet. And yet they believe that. No, but we do have people in Mexico and in Canada, you could identify them, who are similarly fear that somehow greater integration with the United States will mean that Canada will lose all its fresh water. We'll export, water. But, 20% of all the fresh water in the world is in Canada with only 33 million people. This shouldn't be a consuming fear right now. Mexicans, interestingly enough, were the most intense about maintaining their sovereignty, with probably the best reason. But they have lost that the fastest. The other great puzzle of North America is, why is the poorest and weakest nation most interested with the boldest ideas for North America as a whole, and willing to pay a higher price for North American integration than the two richer countries?
That is interesting. Well, we'll be back again with Robert Pastor in just a moment to talk about North American integration. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Bob, let's talk a bit about each of the three countries individually. Here in Canada, we'll be most familiar with ourselves. But from your experience, when you encounter opposition or resistance of some kind to the idea of North America, how does that manifest itself from a Canadian perspective? How do you perceive that? Is it an economic concern? Is it an ideational, identity-based concern? Is it some combination of those?
What's interesting is when the NAFTA debate got underway, it was reasonably clear to identify the hopes and fears of the three countries. The major fears of Canada and Mexico were that the United States would take over their industries, would just purchase their assets, and would have so overwhelming influence as to, in the case of Canada, eliminate its sense of identity, its sense of nationhood. In the case of Mexico, we would take their natural resources. What is interesting is that those fears did not come true. That actually foreign investment in Mexico and Canada increased by a factor of more than 5 in both countries since NAFTA, a really dramatic increase in investment that really stimulated the growth in the first 7 years of NAFTA enormously. But the share of foreign direct investment owned by Americans actually declined. So that fear didn't come true. The hopes didn't come true either. Mexico hoped that NAFTA would be the road to the first world, and it certainly wasn't, although it was the road to the first world for the northern part of Mexico. What's interesting about the consequences of NAFTA on Mexico is that northern part of Mexico grew 10 times faster than the southern part. They averaged out so that the income gap didn't change, but geographically is a very different country to the north of Mexico than it is to the south.
Just a function of the ease of doing business, or was there something more to it than that?
Transport, proximity, closeness to the North American market. That's what made the difference in Monterrey and Guadalajara and all the cities and others to the north, and even on the border area, which has had its terrible problems with drug-related violence. Juarez and Tijuana have grown into extraordinary manufacturing cities and capitals.
So you didn't see a lot of suspicion or resistance on the Mexican side based in identity concerns. That's a very Canadian concern. You didn't see that so much in Mexico.
No. It's like Quebec.
It's confident in its culture and its language.
It's confident in its culture, and it's different from English, so you're not going to get overwhelmed. No, the Mexicans are not at all worried about American culture.
What about in the United States? I mean, there was a while, particularly when Sam Huntington was writing his last work, where there was apparent fear of the Hispanicization of the United States. Was there insecurity on the identity level among Americans, or was that a limited view?
You know, the challenge of identity in Canada is very different than that for the United States. No, I think in the United States, you know, we don't really ask questions about our identity, but we are worried about the latest wave of immigrants. That somehow they're submerging us, we may lose the language. I think that has been historical. Whenever we've had a large wave of migrants from a different region than the previous wave of migrants, Americans get a bit uneasy. If that coincides with an economic downturn, then it gets serious. And that's basically what's happened in the last 3 or 4 years, and why immigration is off of the table for the time being in the United States. So I think it was not really an identity issue in the United States. It's more basic insecurity and fear of new people coming in large numbers at a moment in which our economy can't really absorb them.
Now, that's a very macro concern, and sometimes those of us on the other side of the border watch American politics, and we feel that it's really a micro business, right? American politics is all about very specific individual interests trying to jockey for position. How much of the resistance to the idea of North America and the United States is this sort of large macro kind of issue, and how much is just the routine day-to-day way in which Americans do politics and business?
It's a very good question. I'm not sure I have as good an answer as the question, except to say I think what happened beginning around 2004, 2005, when we saw the largest influx of undocumented migrants coming in, 700,000 a year. Now this is 4 years after 9/11. In that period, 2001 to 2006, we saw the largest influx of undocumented migrants ever. 300 all the way to 750,000 a year. Now think about that for a moment. Americans are slamming down the border in Canada and Mexico to keep out the isolated terrorists, and yet 750,000 people a year are successfully coming into the United States without documents and without apprehension of any kind. So I think there was a period where that, but I think what was unusual is that there was almost a perfect storm, or an imperfect storm, if you will, on both ends of the extreme. That is to say, on the right side of the extreme, they're worried about immigration on a large basis. They're worried about terrorism. On the left side of the screen, they're worried about jobs. being lost. They're worried about inequalities of manufacturing fleeing the United States. The period of 2001 to 2009 was a period of unprecedented export of American jobs. Unprecedented. Manufacturing just declined so, it plummeted. So both extremes, both sides of the American political spectrum that are the most intense, the most active, were both frightened at the same time, and they came together. And actually, Lou Dobbs did give expression to both sides of that extreme. It wasn't coming at it just from the right. He was coming at it from the perspective of job loss, too. And that squeezed the middle and silenced and inhibited the middle. Even George Bush, who was in favor of the Security Prosperity Partnership and greater cooperation between Canada and Mexico and the United States, basically dropped that issue on its tracks. So they inhibited the middle in the United States. They inhibited anybody from talking about cooperation or integration in North America.
Well, fascinating. We'll be right back again with Bob Pastor to talk about North American integration. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's move to the future. So you have a vision of North America. Perhaps you could unpack a bit for us what your longer-term positive vision is of a North American idea.
Well, I think at a personal level, my vision is that Canadians, Mexicans, and Americans all see themselves with a higher degree of affinity, respect, and partnership than they do today. I think, this isn't that much of a problem for Americans because we're so much stronger. It's a problem for Canadians and Mexicans, but it's also in approaching the United States in a way in which they feel they're getting respect from the United States. But it's going to require changes in the way we look at each other. It occurred to me, and one of the reasons I wrote the book, when I was traveling in Europe in the last 10, 15 years, I began to approach Canadians and Mexicans in Europe and realized actually that we felt a lot in common. I felt it first with Mexicans in Spain. The fact that they had the language didn't mean that they had more values or more interest or a similar perspective to Spanish. The Mexicans actually felt closer to us. So at a personal level, I'd like to change the way we look at each other. In many ways, the hardest adjustment will be for the United States because we don't think about it much, but we act in a manner that doesn't always bring Mexicans and Canadians into thinking that they're equal.
Although one of the surprises in your book is that it's actually not that hard to sell. You show in quite a lot of detail the social science demonstrating that actually there's quite a high level of affinity already.
There is, that's right. And some of it has to do with cross-perceptions of each other and stereotypes of each other. Even if people don't feel it, they know what the stereotypes are. The stereotyped view of an American, of a Canadian, is that Canadians are just like us, except they have health care and they don't have guns,
Right.
And the stereotype of Canadians and Mexicans to the United States is that the United States is arrogant, imperious, but also very uninformed about our countries. They don't even know that we have an independent country. So part of it has to do with the stereotype level. So I think the first thing is the mindset of people and how they relate to each other. Then there's the whole level of policy. What a North American community means is that when we think about tax policy, when we think about labor mobility, and when we think about the environment, when we think about pipelines, for example, we think, what do the Canadians and Mexicans think about this? Shouldn't we consult with them first? Shouldn't we make sure that the policies that emerge are coincident or not divergent with each other? Can't we learn something from each other? The most depressing part of the debate on healthcare in the United States is that nobody serious ever stood up and say, well, Canada has a healthcare system and has had it for a long time and it's pretty good. Maybe we don't want the same thing, but is there not something we can learn from Canada? That's what we ought to do. We ought to ask ourselves those questions, particularly in areas that we don't think the others have that much in common. I mean, in foreign policy, it's natural that we should coordinate what Arctic policy may be between the U.S. and Canada, or what Central American policy should be. But in the environmental issues, in healthcare issues, in standardization of care or of products, we don't communicate with each other, we don't consult, we don't coordinate, we don't try to come up with a similar approach. It's incumbent upon us now to do so for our own interest. Because as this market expands, as trade expands, we're going to be producing things together. And that means that we have to produce them to common standards or it won't work. So that's what I hope that the North American idea will communicate at a policy level to the three countries, that we need to find new mechanisms to coordinate and, if possible, unify approaches on areas that we had formerly considered wholly domestic, but now are no longer if we're going to be effective.
Mm-hmm. Now, all three countries are federal. How much of an obstacle is that, in your view, to a North American idea?
When I interviewed Jim Kelleher, a member of Parliament in Canada who played a leading role in getting NAFTA through the Parliament, he said a very interesting point. He said, with NAFTA, the barriers between our provinces may actually be higher than the barriers between our countries.
It's certainly true in some areas.
He said, however, as this debate has proceeded and we become more aware of the barriers between provinces as being an economic impediment, we're doing something about it. I can now drink beer from Alberta in a way that I couldn't before NAFTA. The U.S., Canada has the strongest federal system, with the provinces having the most power. The second is the United States, with our states. Mexico has been a highly centralized state. Only recently has it tried to decentralize and try to transfer some powers, but it's still at a very early level on that. I hope that our three countries may find a way in communicating with each other about a North American approach to issues, that it will be easier to surmount the impediments that exist between our states and the differences. There is no reason why we should have 96 sets of rules on the size and width of trucks in North America right now, because each province and each state has a different set of rules. There's no reason that we should have that. There may be good reasons why there should be differences between provinces, but not on something like that. We need to be able to distinguish between what Michael Hart has referred to as the tyranny of small differences, of trivial differences, and the differences that matter to us. Differences that may matter is in kinds and level of government involvement in healthcare, kinds and levels of involvement in environmental cleanup. We could maybe have differences. My view is over the long term that they should seem less and less important because we all care about healthcare and we all care about the environment. But over the short term, we could have differences. That's fine. But we also ought to separate out those in which are really quite trivial.
Right.
And that would make a North America more practicable.
Very good. We'll be back one last time with Robert Pastor to talk about North American integration. You're watching or listening to Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube. Welcome back. Let's step back and look at North America in the context of the world. So if the North American idea gets traction and moves forward, what does that mean for global governance? What does that mean for the role of this collective of countries in the world?
Great question. There are two dimensions to it. Number one is we are at a very awkward moment in global governance today. The world has grown fast and become very complicated. Global institutions have grown even faster. If you think that the World Trade Organization started in 1947 with just 22 nations, today it's, although it was called the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariff and Trade at the time, today the World Trade Organization has over 150, and it has all of the great powers in it. Russia and China are now major members of the World Trade Organization. It's not a surprise that it's a lot harder now to reach agreement in the WTO than it was 50 years ago. It's not a surprise it's a lot harder to reach agreement on the balance on how to reduce carbon emissions with 192 nations around the table. We may need, for a lot of the challenges that we face in the world, to break them down and try to resolve them at a lower level. Obviously, nations have to try to do that, but we need to find a way beyond nations in smaller regional groups. And North America is one such group that offers that opportunity. The European Union obviously is another alternative. East Asia is still next. And from a trade perspective and from an economic perspective, we are dealing now in a world of basically three competing regions. Those three regions, East Asia, North America, and Europe, constitute roughly 80% of the world product and 80% of the world trade. And most of that trade occurs within each region, not between the regions. So North America has a unique opportunity here if it wants to grab it, but it needs to think about itself first and how it wants to do it. I would say that we'll go back to the beginning of NAFTA. The United States faced a hard issue at the time, which is whether it should have a regional trade agreement or maintain its opposition to other regional trade agreements in order to maintain the strength of the world trading system, which is the role that we played from 1947 until 1992, 1988 or 92. We decided, and the debate was, if we go the North American way, is it not likely to inhibit the World Trade Organization from concluding its next trade round, which was the Uruguayan round? Many people argued that, but it turned out that the opposite happened. It was the success of NAFTA that compelled both Japan and Europe to say, we better have another world trade round, otherwise the United States has another option. We are at that moment today, where the US and Canada is very interested in trying to open to Asia. My view is that if we use the Trans-Pacific Partnership Instrument, which has been recently agreed to in Hawaii as a vehicle for opening up Asia, we will fail. We will fail because China is not a part of that and sees it as an instrument to try to divide Asia. And if China is not a part of an Asian agreement, there's not much of an Asian agreement that's worth counting on because Japan won't be either.
Right.
If we turn first to North America and deepen North American integration, Asia will be knocking on our door. To have a greater impact on world governance, not only do we need the laboratory of North America, we need the leverage of North America. North America as a competitive unit is still the largest economic unit of the three regions in the world. Still, the largest share of world product is produced in North America, 30% of it. So if we show the world that we're more competitive, that we can produce objects and products together in a way that had never been done before, we will not only increase our relative prosperity, but we will increase our leverage vis-a-vis Asia that will want to be a part of that, that will want to open to it. And therefore, the North American model that we developed can then become, and with some adaptation, a global model.
Now, some of the global governance issues on which we've seen deadlock recently, the Doha round for trade and climate change, one of the main cleavages, of course, is the difference between perceived interests of the developed rich countries and the developing poorer countries. In North America, that cleavage is still replicated because Mexico is not at Canada's and the United States level of wealth or economic development. Can North America be a unit from a global perspective on these kinds of issues as long as that difference persists, or do we have to wait until Mexico catches up, Mexico does its Korea, and finally more or less equals the United States and Canada in their overall levels of development?
The relative power of North America in part is derived from the fact that we have three nations at very different levels of power and development. We have a superpower in the United States. We have one of the most advanced middle powers, Canada, with a great independent reputation, and we have a middle income developing country. So if we can show the world that the three countries can work together, that will be very powerful. But more importantly, we faced within North America one of the paramount challenges for the 21st century, which is how to lift middle-income nations up to the first world. And I think we can do that if we concentrate. If we just let the invisible hand of Adam Smith work, it'll take 150 years for the convergence of the Mexican economy with that of Canada and the United States. But if we adapt a policy that has worked in Europe, they have regional and cohesion policies where they invested over $500 billion over 15 years to narrow the income gap between the four poorest countries of Europe and the others. And in 15 years, they narrowed it significantly from 65% of the average per capita income of Europe to 82%. There's a lot to be learned from what they did, both in terms of what worked and what didn't work, of what we want to adapt to the different North American model and what we want to avoid. But that which worked the most effectively was roads, communications, and infrastructure. If Canada and Mexico were to invest with Mexico in creating a road system that goes all the way to the south of Mexico, a North American corridor, if you will, with communications in the south, will lift the southern part of Mexico up to the rest of Mexico, lift all of Mexico up to the first world, create the second largest market in the world for both the US and Canada, with growing exports to that region, improve the economy, and serve as a model for the whole world. That is the real challenge for North America.
It certainly is a challenge, an exciting one. And I'll be curious to know how the book does, and I hope people read it and think thoroughly about these issues the way you've done. Wish people had thought about these earlier. But thanks for coming in. Appreciate your sharing your time and your expertise with us. And to our audience, thank you for joining us as usual, and join us again next week for another episode of Inside the Issues, a CG Online podcast. Look for us at cgonline.org, on Facebook, on Twitter, and on YouTube.